Hey there, welcome to episode 40 of the FFS Talk audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo. We are recording this at just before 1 p.m. on Thursday, August 29, 2024. Today's topic, in an attempt to stay away from day-to-day politics, is a discussion of a more generic collection of issues, things that work, things that don't, the nature of this entire program. What can we do about them? In this case, almost certainly nothing in the near term. But today's topic, Electile Dysfunction, is a look at a few things that could be maybe done better, or at least be more considered more often, considered in greater detail by more people for a greater awareness how our system works. Sometimes it does not. It's it's the worst system in the world except for all the others, or something like that. Could be debatable. As you may know, the FFS Talk audio program is a program designed to present things that work, things that don't, and what can we do about them. So it's not necessarily a rant, but more highlighting those three things. Ideally, this would be a program of discussion with other interested parties, especially if they are in any way subject matter experts. But for now, we continue to plant seeds of discussion, perhaps in the near term. Election season is always a charged time, so maybe not the ideal time to talk about what we could do about things, since no one is talking about what to do, only what should be done. They should get rid of the Electoral College, etc. But we'll see. I don't want to discuss preferred candidates, specific policies from a political standpoint. I'm interested in policies from a practical standpoint. What does it mean to fix prices? What does it mean to deport millions of people? Depends. And political parties are, of course, part of the problem. So party line always makes discussion tricky. It makes forming interconnected policies that have some sort of a plan involved that isn't politically charged, aimed at maintaining power. Makes those tricky too. So this is not a partisan presentation. It is merely, again, planting some seeds for further discussion down the road. Who can say? But hey, why not? It's topical. 'Tis the season. And of course, if you don't know what FFS means, you need to meet more Irish people. Hopefully, wherever you found this audio program, you are able to access the episode description, wherein you will find the show notes. I do not have links for today's episode because, I have two links. Because this is planting some seeds, I would much rather do a deep, there'd be too many links. I would rather focus on particular areas in future episodes, and especially if I can move back. This particular program has never had guests, but it's always been planned. It's the intent is to have guests. So eventually, with a guest or two, to talk about things like Electoral College or voting machines or ballots and polling places, or whatever the case may be. Especially as it applies to where I live right now, which is in southern Nevada, Clark County, city of Las Vegas, Ward 6, I think, for city council. I don't remember what districts for state and federal. I could look those up, though, because we are in the information age. So those show notes, I will read the summary, and I will, as usual, provide shameless self-promotion with my two coffee-related links. Let's get on with it. The summary: politics is no fun, but the mechanisms of the U.S. election system, and by extension, the individual states, and so on, and general determinations regarding districting, ballot management, and the construction of such things as the Senate and the Electoral College, all worthy of some discussion. So let's plant some seeds today. The links, as usual, as I mentioned: shameless self-promotion, buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo. I say Ko-fi to emphasize K-O, Ko-fi. I don't know if the tricky naming works or not. Better to be clicked on than read or heard. perhaps. Ko-fi.com/DanHugo. These are for shameless self-promotion, but not for making money. You are under no obligation to spend money. Although if you do, any proceeds through either of these platforms goes directly towards coffee, which is what powers all of my projects, in addition to cash, but that's a different thing. So you are welcome to, but are under no obligation to, buy me a coffee or otherwise. I use these sites to link to my various audio productions, other projects. That's about it. So I'll keep it short this time because there are no other links to go through. There could be many, many, many links, but I do only, I think one time in, I believe it was the Cafe Genius Impresario's audio program, I ran out of space for links. The platform, Spotify for podcasters, which is not perfect by any means, does have a character limit. And so I had too many links and I had to cut some of them out and so on. It's not ideal. So today, quite the opposite. So let's, again, plant seeds. And ideally, this will be the beginning of some discussions along the way. There's a lot to ponder here in one of the fundamentals of our democratic republic, our federal government made up of many states. So yeah, let's begin. I am a computer engineer by education and trade. So by analogy, I'm going to provide a comparison. I see this comparison frequently on the awful platform LinkedIn and in general blog posts sometimes. The comparison of microcontrollers and microprocessors. You may not know the difference. That's fine. Know that there are two different things. They could be two different computer parties. Just know that there are two. There could be more than two, but these are the two most popular. See where we're going? This is a common topic of discussion. So in my line of work, especially because I've done so much embedded programming in the exciting world of making, you have companies like Arduino, companies like Raspberry Pi and their products, their competitors in similar product spaces. Many people will lump them together, but the original Arduino products based on the AT microcontrollers from, what is the name of the company? I'm totally spacing on it right now. They were purchased by Microchip, Atmel, right? Atmel. Is it Atmel? No, I gotta look. Not supposed to be such a focus of this episode. Yeah, Atmel. Now a Microchip. Oh, AVR microcontrollers. Yeah, that's the. It's a RISC microcontroller. Anyway, so you have products based on microcontrollers, and you have like Arduino Uno, back in the old days, and then you have Raspberry Pi based on a variant of an ARM system on a chip, SoC, which is a microprocessor with peripherals. And so often you will see discussions that, microcontrollers have peripherals and built-in flash and other components and so on. Don't worry, I'm getting somewhere with this. So what you end up with is a discussion of features rather than design goals. So microprocessor back in the day, the 4004, the first integrated circuit microprocessor from Intel. Remember them while they're still here? The 4004 launched in 1971, as it turns out, and so was I. The microprocessor was designed to execute code and whatnot, but over the years, you've had various performance improvements, keeping up with Moore's Law and all that. So microprocessors have a particular function, a particular application. Microcontrollers, different again. The two very different specific things that are actually fundamentally similar. Recognizing the similarities in their common functionality helps to differentiate those actual differences. So that is, microcontrollers and microprocessors are fundamentally similar. They execute code and they make decisions based on variables, and they can change memory values, and they can make sounds by driving input-output pins, and the list goes on. So they're very similar, but the differences really come down to those two design choices. Microcontrollers are very specifically designed for deterministic code execution. so that everything takes the same amount of time every time. I actually, when I was working at Intel, that's a sort of a disclaimer, I suppose. I had a discussion with one of the two. This will indicate the time frame, I suppose. Two people at Intel Corporation that were assigned to investigating Intel's participation in the drone space, unmanned, as they say. You can say unpersoned, I guess. Unmanned aerial vehicle systems, controllers, and so on. End of the day, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, really frowns on having Intel processors, for example, running in systems because Intel processors are made to be fast for gaming and data processing and so on, not intended for the rigors of real-time controlling of things like rudders and ailerons and engines and attitude and keeping airplanes in the air. So you have companies like BAE, I think it is. I think Raytheon is in there for some reason. There are various companies that focus on designing systems that comply with FAA requirements, which include deterministic code execution. So if you are running a piece of code that takes 10 microseconds to execute, it must always take 10 microseconds to execute. It cannot pause to access virtual memory or to respond to a user input from a keyboard or a click or drive a display. None of those things. It is very specifically designed for deterministic code execution. It doesn't have to be fast. It has to be the same. Now you can get a faster part if you need it to be in 5 microseconds or whatever you need to do to meet the design spec. But deterministic code execution. So in fact, to have Intel processors pass FAA certifications, many of the features that make your favorite Core whatever fast for gaming, fast for editing videos and whatnot, you'd have to turn those features off. Things like caching and speculative execution, none of those things are compatible with the notion of deterministic code execution. At the same time, you have in a microcontroller the lowest possible latency of I/O access. So when I'm running my deterministic code and I'm sampling my attitude sensor, my gyroscope and other similar devices to indicate where the airplane is pointing, I need to be able to read that value from an external peripheral device, wherever the gyro is in the physical aircraft. I need to be able to capture that data, include it in my calculations, run a deterministic code loop, do the calculation, and then perhaps control a surface. I want to move the ailerons or I want to move the elevator a certain amount. And I need to get feedback to know that the elevator has moved the indicated amount and so on. So all of these communications are in the context of a deterministic code loop happening with minimal possible latency. If you look at how microprocessors are built, they will often have, especially SoCs for laptops and so on, systems on a chip. You will find, and we demonstrated this in the lab at Intel. If you take a true microcontroller and you tell it to toggle one I/O pin to make a square wave, it will make a square wave. And predictably, repeatable, you get a square wave. If you took hopefully that's clear. If you took our Edison, which was a Arduino compatible device board, maker board, built around Atom processors that were used in cell phones back when Intel had cell phones. I played with an Intel mobile phone. It was actually fine. It was a nice product. It's too bad. The Edison that was my group that was building those, we would do the same code. We'd have the same code running on a microprocessor, system on a chip intended for mobile phones, running Linux with an Arduino compatibility layer on top. Now when you say toggle this I/O pin to make a square wave, you get a square wave that's moving around a little bit. It's changing in period a little bit. Every once in a while it would pause because Linux would switch out the Arduino task. All of the I/O through the pins were routed through a switching fabric of sorts so that you could vary the functionality of pins. You can do the same on microcontrollers, but those variances are made to be fast. So you don't want to have it going through 5 layers of indirection so that your signal takes 25 times longer than it should, and so on. So these are differences. These are possibly meaningless to you listening today, or they may be critical. Depends on context, use cases, and perhaps some understanding of the system and its requirements. You can say the same exact things that I've just said right now about political parties, and sometimes about the election process. There's usually more going on than meets the eye. You, as a normal person, perhaps don't think about microcontrollers versus microprocessors, or political party R versus D, or D versus R, or even G versus I, or whatever. But occasionally those differences are essential. You just don't think about it. So let us begin the meat of today's episode with things that work, sort of. So it turns out breaking up the vote, a national election, which we have coming up November 5, 2024, breaking up into states for a national election is actually not bad. It separates, each state has quirks, from how you get on the ballot, to how the actual elections are conducted, to management of polling places and polling place configurations, whether they allow mail-in ballots, when the mail-in ballots need to be sent out to the voters, when they're due back in, the mechanics of dropping off a ballot. And I will point out right now, I have worked in a polling place once in California. Very interesting experience. It's something that more people should do, so that you're familiar directly with how these things work. How extended voting windows work, right? It used to be election day. Now it's an election month. When can you mail in? When can you visit a polling place? When can you get some help if you need it? It depends on where you are. This can vary by state and possibly by county. I've not really looked into it that closely. Really, the county you're in matters, except for when you look at the news. We'll get to that. Then everything matters, and nothing is really explained clearly. They all make for a system that is less susceptible to chicanery. It is really difficult to fix an election, to rig an election. When it is not a single election, it is many thousands of precincts and individuals that are, managing the actual voting, and people coming to the site, the polling place, submitting a vote, a ballot, going through the process of making their selections on a ballot and verifying that they are registered to vote, and all the whole 9 yards. All of that is happening in these small groups, and small groups in many places with many individuals, different rules. Makes it tricky to rig that election, to coin a phrase. So the apparent chaos of the system is actually not a bad thing. It makes it difficult to scale. How come they all can't just do it this one way? Why did that, whichever county it was in Florida, why did they use the Chad ballots with the hanging Chads and all? Well, the problem comes in because people only look at their voting system during an election. After an election, who cares? We got 2 years to worry about it. We're not going to budget money and assign resources to investigating that. It's not going to be an issue for another 2 years. Nobody wants to talk about an election coming up in 2 or 4 years. Some people do. I don't. But now you run into some problems when there's a transition to the use of the same voting machines, for example, especially if those voting machines have security weaknesses that are used. The machines can be used ubiquitously, but the security weaknesses follow along. And time again, there have been demonstrations of weakness if there's physical access to a machine, which is always a problem. If you can get your hands on a thing, then you can you can break it open, you can manipulate how it functions and so on, voting machine or otherwise. There's a difference between being outside someone's home and inside someone's home. If you have physical access to a home, once you are inside the home, the game is very different. Same with voting machines and many other things. Protracting the campaign process, protracted if you like. So a protracted campaign that lasts for years is actually, how to fix my notes there, especially with the modern connected age, is actually not awful because it enables a longer term examination of candidates. You don't necessarily need to track every word they say. Most people don't do that anyway. You can look at policies. You can look at how things are evolving for the whichever, unfortunately, party is in power at the moment. So you can begin to take a closer look at what you would want, what you would expect, what's working and what isn't at the government level, local, state, federal. And sorry, typing a little bit there. So now you don't need to cram for the test on election day. You don't have to learn everything. Which candidate do I want to vote for? Which everyone does, right? Everybody does the research and makes an informed decision. But because a protracted campaign process, the election season, and I just said earlier, people don't want to talk about fixing voting machines and process the day after an election, even if it was problematic. They're like, we got 2 years to worry about it. But it turns out if the campaign for the next election begins the day after the current election, there would be some room for discussion and sometimes lawsuits and so on. So these are actually useful to have a protracted campaign for discussion. Individual voters in a constituency in a given district or county or whatever can discuss over time with many people in many forms and forums. Could be in person at your coffee shop or pub or town hall. Other such discussions could be online. Often many things are skewing towards online versus in person. Could be following your favorite YouTuber or podcaster who talks about such things, or maybe getting in on a discussion on a Discord server or similar. Sometimes the information in the air is actually accurate or close. Sometimes. Hyperlocal polling places and polling in general hands accountability to smaller groups of people and spreads risk across many smaller groups of people. Many smaller groups of people. So when you when you have a polling place near where you live and you visit that polling place, you may see people you know. Those people working the polls, as they say, which I did. I said I did it once in California. You have a greater chance of knowing the people that are taking your ballot, that are keeping an eye on things. The national media may not know those people, and you'll run into trouble like, oh, look at this person's sticking ballots in their pants or whatever. That may be a sensational view, but a person at a polling place may like, oh no, I know that person. I know what they were doing. I was there. I saw it. That was not what you're describing. It was very different. You have to look at before, during, and after, not just the during part. For example, I'm just making up an example at this point, but the take home is that because individuals in their community are managing a polling place and they're responsible for checking the machines and checking the ballots and sealing up boxes and signing documents and attesting to, having followed the rules and all the various things. And this varies with, wherever you vote, and it could be different rules in counties and states and so on. But the take home is that when you hand responsibility to individuals, they tend to take that civic duty more seriously than is perceived in a rhetorical abstraction. So, and again, having worked in a polling place, I found that everybody involved had no agenda and the best intentions to do what they're supposed to do. Don't do this. Don't allow someone to do that. If you're going to accept a drop-off vote ballot for someone else, it has to be signed in a certain way. There's a sort of a don't ask, don't tell. I'll tell you specifically, one person came in, he had 2 ballot envelopes. He said, I'm dropping mine and my wife's ballots off. And the polling place manager, I guess, said, oh, let me see your wife's ballot. Oh, she didn't sign the corner over here. She's supposed to sign in 2 places to indicate that you are dropping it off for her. So you sign that this is my ballot and I am enabling someone else to drop it off for me. And he was like, And she said, well, there's another polling place nearby. Just walk in, say you're dropping off ballots, drop them in the box. Don't say anything. Now, was she doing something sneaky? Not really. You could tell the person is not dropping off fake ballots. He's not got a box of ballots to drop off. He was behaving in a in an upstanding way, and the person managing our polling place did the same. Don't tell me that you didn't sign or that your wife didn't sign. The ballots are fine. Did you dot the I and cross the T? Maybe not. If this person, again, we're bringing in a box of ballots, hey, I'm bringing in ballots for my entire company. That's very different. Husband dropping off ballot for himself and his wife, just drop it off. You'll be fine. This takes the polling place manager out of the loop. Now, obviously, this is a voter education process breakdown, if you like. Sign in 2 places. Everything's fine. Signature checking is not even going to happen. Nobody was checking against signature cards and whatnot. So the intent was clear. The process needs some work. It was getting a vote counted that mattered in this case. And again, I think it would have been very different if it were shady, if it had a certain smell to it. This was very clearly, he walked in saying very specifically, this is my ballot or my wife's ballot. Not trying to be sneaky at all. So if you are a strict constructionist, you may say, hey, she didn't sign it, you can't submit it. This probably comes down to human judgment, perhaps, but really better process. But at the end of the day, it is the involvement of people in communities that take their responsibilities seriously, that make some of this system work as well as it does, for as poorly as it works in many cases. So let's get to the things that so those are the things that work, and there are more things that work, but that's just some quick ones. And you may be listening right now saying, what? The person told him to not follow the rules at a different polling place? And again, it all comes down to scale. One ballot being dropped off by, now technically the person may not be registered to vote, or maybe not alive even. And these would be problems. It turns out here in Nevada, there are actual, it takes a while, but there have actually been arrests and convictions for people voting for a dead spouse or other. These are anecdotal. These are 5, 6 over the years. So not enough to sway an election, but certainly an opportunity to improve the process. We could do these things. Performance and perception versus reality. So we only have more access to our candidates in the election process now, regardless of specific characters and dates, local, national, more of everything. So whoever your favorite candidate is, wherever you are, you just have more access. They're online, they're on cable news, they're interviewing on YouTube channels, the list goes on. So more and more access. And we have devices in our pockets. If you are jonesing for what your favorite candidate is saying today, you can probably pull it up and see who tweeted what, where, and whatever, which means there is more and more performance that tends to follow talking points and the target audience. So who am I talking to? What do they want to hear? We want to stick to our messaging. We want to be on message. Perception of these performances will vary and can follow confirmation bias and motivated reasoning and all the greatest hits in that regard. So humans are bias machines. And if we have a favorite candidate, or if we're an issue voter, that's where political parties really take advantage. But you're coupled with the typical person only directly experiencing some fraction of the performances. You are not watching cable news or whatever, 25 screens, 24 hours a day, or nightmares like that. So you don't have the time, the bandwidth, the desire perhaps to keep track of every performance that appears everywhere, and then the interpretation of same. And the performances are amplified with their choice of discussion forums, with your choice. So you'll see here on the news, Twitter is reacting to trending on Twitter. Is Twitter a representative sample of our population? Maybe not. Depends on how many of those accounts are real, but it's really their usage stats don't say that Twitter is a true indicator. And they're too quick to react, and motivation for posting on Twitter is often clout, not honesty, so that you're measuring performance on the part of people who post and opine on Twitter. By the way, this is why most pub rules, if you're a pub visitor, sometimes coffee shops, but definitely a pub, the discussions of politics and religion are forbidden. Why bother, right? There's always going to be an argument. So if there's always an argument wherever people are discussing things, the tendency may be to have a particular forum that leans one way or another. If there are only two political parties, maybe there should be more. But so you end up with, I don't want to go. I'll only go there to troll, to stir up trouble, to get a little dopamine hit or some adrenaline rush and get on. So sometimes the motivation for discussion is questionable, may not be completely valid for real discussion. Reality is often perceived, as opposed to performance, as a result of gathering and analyzing these performances, factual research, some thoughtful reflection, and some discussion with others, perhaps of like mind or of differing opinions. And that's where we start learning pragmatism that is not nearly so exciting and which requires an investment of time and effort that is not available for most to spend. So you don't have the time, nor do I, to delve into every single detail, every accusation, every questionable quote, every factual variation, poor recollections, clipped videos that represent events in a different way, and so on. It gets to be ridiculous. You get distracted by the reporting and not on the events, for example. Real information versus an emotional appeal. Now, performance is easier when one can get a crowd excited. You want to hear your rally crowd cheering and so on. You have a message to get out. You're performing for the sake of getting that message out. You want to have people talking about you tomorrow. You want to have a water cooler discussion. You want to have them posting on social media. Yeah, take pictures for Instagram. You want to get them perhaps angry, because an angry response is visceral and it will tend to drive some action. If everybody's having a good time, it's why we don't need to worry. If you get them angry at your opponent, even better. If you can direct their anger, but being generally angry at the status quo is a good strategy for non-incumbent candidates. The person with the job today is doing a bad job. Vote for me. So these can yield better results, and you get dopamine and adrenaline bursts from your audience. And this can be online too, but in-person rallies, the whistle stops, I guess, when candidates used to ride around in a train, rather famous. I believe FDR did that. He may have done it with Harry S. Truman when he switched to a different vice president. But that was the way back then. There was no TV, there was no Twitter and Facebook and whatnot. There was no Instagram and TikTok. You had to actually go out and talk to people. And then people would write newspaper articles about their view of things. Facts are boring and are often erroneous, or maybe they're just false. Maybe they're just lies, perhaps, largely because a performance often relies on memory of those emotional appeals rather than time spent on research and references. So you don't want to hear me talk about percentage rates and velocity curves for fuel prices and grocery prices. You may not even want to hear that Lena Khan is opening FTC investigations into grocery pricing, right? These are boring details. I want to hear how you're going to fix my problem for me and inflict some damage on people I don't like. So rather than citing sources or specifically quoting or referring to particular actions, the process is ongoing, but people don't want to hear work in progress. They want to hear whose head is going to roll because of this. So whether it's during a rally or during a debate, fact checking takes a while, and it's, the winner of the debate has already been declared. It doesn't matter if what they were saying made any sense or was had any veracity to it whatsoever. So fact checking versus the performance of emotionally charged claims, those make for a more exciting time. An emotional appeal has a lasting impact later, too, at the pub or around the old water cooler. Do you discuss policy, economic data, geopolitics when you're out and about with your friends? Or that one thing they said about the other thing and how angry the other side will be? And, libtards is probably an indication of where the world is right now. And MAGA, of course. MAGA is used as a derogatory term by some and as a term of endearment by others. So you get into name calling and this is all propaganda techniques, right? You turn the other side into a caricature that you can malign and bring about a visceral hatred of. The Electoral College and the Senate proportionality problem. This is a real problem, in my opinion, and many others' opinions. States' rights were a real problem getting our federal government formed back in the day, 1787, was it? The Great Compromise was one of the essential elements making full ratification possible. The other big sacrifice were various atrocities against humanity that linger with us to this day. Both do, actually. The Senate making equal representation for bounded geographical regions makes sense with nicely distributed population, especially in our young colonial times when the states were all small, population was small. So of course, well, each state wants we are the independent, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we will be heard as an equal, and whatever. I'm making that up, but I'm sure something like that was said. The formation of the bicameral legislation, the House of Representatives, the lower house, representing population, the people. I actually don't know how many congressional House of Representatives, how many representatives were in Congress for the first session. Was it 435 or some other number? Don't know. Didn't check. Left to the listener. But the Senate, the upper house, is intended to be, as has been referred to in recent years, the cooling saucer, the slow and deliberative body of government that represents, and they have a 6-year term, of course, so they can take their time, slowly consider issues at hand. The problem, of course, is that 2 senators from each state works great when states are about the same size, the same population in general. Things are getting up and running, and you're like, okay, well, each state has equal representation in the upper house and population representation in the lower house, and then they'll interact through this voting process and bills going back and forth and negotiations and so on. So, okay, everything's great. Unfortunately, the state of California is usually the example with, 40 million, 44 million people. And the state of Kentucky, the great state of Kentucky, where Mitch McConnell hails, from which he hails. So a senator from a state with like a tenth the population or something has as much power as a senator from a state with 44 million, or in that case, a senator representing 22 million people-ish, versus a senator representing maybe 2 million people. And in fact, Mitch McConnell had substantial power in the Senate for things like consenting, advice and consent for a Supreme Court justice nomination, making a determination when a nomination would be accepted for that advice and consent based on political leanings, right? Clearly an agenda. Because the Senate is so out of touch with the reality of population distribution, and as a throwback to states' rights, you get this proportionality problem where smaller states are given as much sway based on geography, on the boundaries of a geographical area, not on the number of people that live there. So if the population of a state is, 5, 10, 100, 1,000, maybe a million, say a million, maybe a 500,000, the state gets 3 representatives, 2 Senate, 1 House. A state like California gets 2 senators and however many, I cannot remember how many representatives. I used to live in California, so I did know this at one point. I think Nevada has 5 or 7. These are numbers I check but don't retain in memory. So the bottom line is that your area, your region on a map has representation in the Senate, not necessarily the people living in that region. And that proportionality problem becomes very real given the amount of power that the Senate has over our legislative process, and in a bigger sense, the running of our government. So the Electoral College was designed to insulate the election of a president from the uninformed public. The electors, the delegates sent to the Electoral College, used to be selected by the legislatures of the several states. Now they're open to selection through voting, but even then, the votes must be certified at the state level. The electors sent to the Electoral College, and so on. Potential for some chicanery there as well. But relying on state legislatures provides a form of representation in selection of leaders. So, like, we're voting, however states were conducting any sort of public opinion polls, the legislature would select the electors. And then when you move to direct selection of the electors, you're still electing representatives to go to the Electoral College and make a decision on your behalf. And those electors are a representative subsample of a population. This is where you run into case of arguments against the case of popular vote versus Electoral College. The case for the popular vote is based on this filtering process, or filtering outcomes. So the Electoral College filters out the masses. If you have a majority in a particular district, voting precincts and districts and counties and so on, depending on how you've drawn the lines, and we'll get into gerrymandering in a second, you can have local majority, even though you have, I will say, larger but local. So if you break a population into districts, voting districts and precincts and whatnot, and you say, okay, we've drawn these lines so that each of the bounding areas has more of one party than the other. But if you look at the larger division, right? So if you take a county, the county may have more of party D than R. But if you draw your districts creatively, you might end up with districts that have more R's than D's. So you end up with a inversion of majority because you've broken the majority measurements up into smaller units that have a selected regional boundary. And so you are selecting this bias specifically to change the nature of the majority. And then if you sum up the majorities, if you say, okay, well, that one's majority R, that one's majority R, but if you combine those two, it's a majority D. So just don't combine them. You just take majority. So if you collect the majorities, you end up with, oh, look, that region goes for the R party. But if you actually look at the numbers, the popular vote in total, without those boundaries, it might go to the D party. So this sort of thing happens. And this is all over the news. It's not a surprise. So what's curious, though, is why it is just accepted as fact. It's sort of unreal to me. This is, to me, one of the gaping holes in our system. But again, the Electoral College was intended to filter. There are some people who will say it revolved around those human rights atrocities, which are not the topic of today's episode. But in general, the general effect, the motivations are probably several, but the general effect is you end up filtering the specifics, the granularity of a popular vote down to a representative vote that can be manipulated, and sometimes is. The case for and against the Electoral College specifically becomes more interesting as we have seen more voting from constituents, otherwise. So in other words, you have more of a constituency voting one way in the popular vote, but the Electoral College going the other way. This has happened, twice in the last 20 years or so? Hanging chads. Oh, production by a street. So the other argument that the Electoral College somehow levels the playing field. So on the one hand, you say, oh, this was for the southern states because of population differences. The Electoral College somehow levels the playing field for smaller states. So this could be aimed at the southern states, or it could be just general. This is the Senate argument. Oh, you have more people, so that means you'll leave us out as a state because we have fewer people. And today you might think, well, yeah, but at the time, states' rights were driving a lot of decisions. Got to get everybody on board to ratify this thing. So okay, we'll make this concession, and the states will have equal or more equal, proportionate plus, the new logo, representation in the Electoral College with delegates and whatnot, so electors. So the level playing field for smaller states somehow goes back to, well, we won't get any attention because we don't have population. And this was before there were states like California, right? The entire population of the country wasn't skewed so heavily into like 5 states. So the notion was, well, let's make it make each state have a balanced amount of input into the electoral process, and treat each state as a block rather than the population of each state. Individuals in each state have their various concerns, but because of the way votes are counted and they're split up and majorities are selected, you are able to draw a national map of the United States as blue and red states. But this has been shown many times, and I'll leave that for you to discuss and discover. If you take individual votes, or if you take a less general view of regions, so you break it down into precincts or districts. Districts is tricky if there's gerrymandering, but you will show that the country is not red or blue based on state boundaries. It is really just generally purple. There's just such a mixture of opinion. So when you filter out popular opinion for the sake of selection electors or senators based on geographical boundaries drawn either, when a state was formed or according to gerrymandered voting districts, you end up with very different and skewed results that are not truly representative. And we are a democratic republic after all. So polling chaos, gerrymandering, which we've been talking about, and districts in general, polling at scale fuels the 24-hour news cycle. There's always something to talk about. If there was just a recent poll from pick your favorite entity, no matter what it is, a poll will become available a day or so later, giving some population sample opinion that makes the headlines. So who won the debate last night? Who thinks what in this thing that happened 25 minutes ago? Without knowing the mechanisms of polling, these numbers get a lot of attention, might have credibility assigned to them in some way to sway discussions. So it might be just saying, this is a good poll, maybe historically a reasonably accurate poll. So to sway the decisions of voters, depending on when it takes place, or it may mean nothing, depending on when it takes place, or at least drive conversation and political advertising and so on. But what are they really saying with these polls? Since each state is broken down into districts for selection of representatives in the House and Senate, that's a division by two. The ability or tendency to draw those districts to favor one political party over another can have a lingering effect on precincts and delegate selections for electoral college and polling. In an all or nothing configuration, which is most states, I don't even know if there is one that gives proportionate delegate representation. I think that's been talked about. Grouping ballots so that one political party has a majority in selected subpopulations rather than on the whole makes for an infamous popular vote versus electoral college differential, especially for the President of the United States. I think this is probably the only place that comes up as far as elections, but it also matters for public opinion. And when you hear national polling, because polling of a population requires random selection for most cases, I'm personally leaning towards asking the same people questions over time to measure trends and opinion change, evolution of opinion. But some would argue that a true random population sample is the only way to judge response to news of the day, policy announcements, geopolitical scenarios that impact price of gas, et cetera, et cetera. So random population samples, interesting. Those are tricky to do in the age of cell phones and do not call and different ways of reaching people. The old days of calling people right before dinner or contacting people through the day was still sort of problematic. Reaching people is tricky, but when you sample a population at random, that population is spread across districts that were not drawn at random. They were drawn with an agenda. So you're taking a random sample of a population that is in specifically selected voting districts. So you're not selecting randomly within a district. You're not selecting proportionately based on district sizes, etc. You're just choosing at random. So a random poll of a general population could be very different than the polling outcomes from an election with precincts in gerrymandered districts and so on and so on. So polling really is chaos. And the mechanisms of polling are a little crazy. The Rasmussen poll, known for leaning conservative. Well, what does that mean? What does that really mean? In the popular vote, on the whole, more or less valid. Is the popular vote more or less valid than splitting the popular vote into states and further dividing that vote into districts to filter out real majority for a preferred majority? That is to say, we want to know what our gerrymandered districts think. We don't necessarily want to know what everybody thinks. We want to filter that down into red states and blue states. This makes it a lot easier to run campaigns and to predict outcomes and do reporting. And that's where you get the wonks versus the normies. A wonk is not a derogatory term. It's somebody who's particularly expert in something. You could be a political wonk. You could be a policy wonk. You could be an economics wonk. You could be a computer wonk. These are just people who take a substantial proactive interest in something, become legitimate experts or at least extremely knowledgeable. Then you have normal people who don't have time or inclination for any of that. So as more and more media and access to media, whether it's printed word, radio, television, internet, social media, more to come, as direct neural interconnects have become completely integrated into an election process, the election and campaigning and the entire process in general is now a full-time gig lasting years. You got to keep up with all the social media that can be ongoing, the cost of entry, the barrier to entry. You can strike up a political campaign on any social media platform essentially for free. And you can have somebody manage it for you, and they may be doing it on a volunteer basis. That's how some things work. Political wonks are often paid. They're either paid directly as an analyst or pundit. Maybe they're surrogates. Maybe they are paid by the local media, whatever it is, the news station, the network, the legacy media, mainstream media. Maybe the new media, people with a YouTube channel with a substantial following, they can actually afford to pay people to provide direct analysis on an ongoing basis. So they spend their days consuming all of the chatter of the politics of the day, every day. Or maybe their audience is paying for things through Patreon, through Substack newsletter subscriptions. They consume advertising. So people can actually be paid to keep up with the politics and the silliness that you don't have time to do. So you normal people, we normal people, you're the actual voters. So you rarely have the time, the inclination, the focus, or the savvy. And I don't mean that in you're just not a wonk. You are you are consuming opinions from people who spend 10, 100 times as much time and energy on these topics every day. So for you to sample enough data to compete with that requires a similar level of commitment that most people just don't want to do. That's the reason we have representative government, after all. Let them focus daily. You're supposed to represent my interests. I'm not supposed to be watching over every single moment of how my representatives function. But elections kind of turn that over. We don't have the time to track the subtleties, the implications, the timelines, the evolution of a candidate, the policies, the discussions, the accusations, the general state of affairs of political figures who will ultimately make important decisions or sometimes will not. So they listen. So we, not they, we listen to wonks of choice, whoever we resonate with, or they resonate with us. And so regardless of actual credibility and competence, so everybody has an agenda, and you may like the cut of Joe Rogan's jib. You may really enjoy listening to Mark Thompson, the Mark Thompson show, I think it is. You may particularly enjoy Fox News, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, whatever. You consume news sometimes to reinforce decisions that you have already made. Confirmation bias is a real thing. And the list goes on. So there's an us versus them problem. That's really, even though I'm mentioning it towards the end here, it's probably the place to begin. Any electoral process, sorry, let me do a little note adjustment there. Any electoral process becomes a matter of sides, much like sports. The emotional investment in one's team is more important than details, so that winning becomes everything, and outcomes down the road are left to people with more time. You could vote for your favorite candidate because they promised you the world, and then down the road, things don't turn out the way they promised they were going to, without regard to the mechanisms of how decisions are made. One of my go-to examples is you may have run for student council in high school, or maybe your friend did, and they said, I'm going to abolish homework and make recess, if you still had recess, time between classes, break time. We're going to change the rules about lunch, open campus, whatever. They'll make all these campaign planks that are completely and totally unrealizable. Like, yeah, you're on student council. You're a student in the school. You can't change those rules. You have no such powers. And then later down the road, you say, oh, that never happened. They made an empty promise and they didn't execute because the presidential candidates will tend to make promises that require the legislature to take action that will accomplish those goals if we ignore executive orders, which we should. The emotional investment becomes more important, though. So we want to win regardless of whether the things that we have just won can ever come to pass. Then later the effects come home, like, oh, they promised that we would have this and we ended up with that, and I'm going to vote them out of office. I'm not going to vote. So if one political party wins, the other fumes, gets angry for a term, and for the next round, the vote counts may go the other way. Like, oh, they didn't deliver on what they promised. I'm not going to vote for them this time. And then the other side says, oh, we're going to win. And then it goes back and forth. You get oscillation between party majorities and policies that can make agenda continuity and momentum difficult. You could, a farcical example would be one party is going to build and the other party is going to demolish. So if you've ever been to Vegas, you know that those are two big activities on the Strip. So if you're always building for 4 years and demolishing for 4 years and building for, depends on if you're building and demolishing the same building, perhaps. So continuity, which political parties don't necessarily help, could result in outcomes that take longer than one term or two terms, that require a certain amount of negotiation, consensus, coalition. So the lack of this momentum can be counterproductive. Like I said, it can be time spent building, unbuilding, trying to make a case for your party. Oh, I just need 5 more years, especially with the notion of an executive order, like I said. So if you can just make rules without the legislative process, which was specifically designed into our form of government to avoid a ruling king, as was the case back in the day, King George, kind of a jerk. The premise of our government relies on, or is based upon, the legislature driving things, which is a representative body of the population, the body politic. So when you enable executive orders by a leader who is elected by a representative sampling, quote unquote, representative sampling of a population through the Electoral College, you've divorced the notion of representation from the notion of action. The president executes the executive office. The executive orders, perhaps in preference to those getting bogged down in Congress. Those political processes are a pain. So political parties and primaries and the whole candidate selection process are not part of government. They are part of the business of government. They are often confused and made to be a part of a democratic process. We hear that now in the 2024 presidential election upcoming, that we didn't even get to select our candidate and so on. Well, but technically you did because of okay, so a lot of argument, but political parties and primary elections and so on are not constitutional. They're administrative. They are business, right? They're a way to build a form of coalition beforehand so that you can gather funding, pay for the process of becoming elected. Advertising takes money. Hiring people on the ground takes money. Fueling offices in different localities and connecting with volunteers and printing signs, and this all takes money. So there's the power of consolidation. In the real world, there'd be some antitrust action against the oligopoly that is the two-party system. We don't have that, so everybody's fine with just being frustrated every 2 years or so. Why do we have political parties? Why can't my party be on the ballot, and so on? So it's the business of government that gets a little bit tricky. The political parties are not a part of the democratic process. They take advantage of it, but they are they are precisely the vehicles of a path to the electoral showdown that we all love. So, Super Bowl, World Series, elections, they are all viscerally exciting. They are not necessarily fair. They're not necessarily democratic, whatever democratic means anymore. So obviously these will not happen, but here are some ideas for... Why is that doing that? Yeah, there we go. Sorry, more notes. So some ideas that probably won't happen. Ranked choice voting and open elections. That's a crazy idea, I know. Rather than filtering down to two political mega parties, allowing the population at large to select their leadership via ranked choice voting and allowing winners to build coalition on the pressing matters of the day after they're elected. This happens in other countries sometimes. Sometimes it works well, sometimes not so much. But it opens up the field to allow more, it may open up the field to allow more paid lobbying. So you can have others build coalition for you in exchange for money. But it connects, and that is to say, I need to connect people in 5 or 6 different parties now. So that's going to take more money, more greasing of palms and whatnot. All legal lobbying. But it connects voter intent with representative action. You add in some transparency and an informed electorate, and maybe there could be some accountability for your candidate that you wanted to have elected, not necessarily the candidate that was selected by the party committee. Digitized voting process. So in other words, you should be able to not only select a candidate, the real plurality winner through ranked choice voting. Ranked choice eventually yields a majority based on the second and additional choices. So eventually you end up with a candidate that it probably represents more people in a particular voting area. The Electoral College is not going anywhere, so we can't really, it's not even worth talking about right now. A constitutional amendment is all but impossible nowadays. There are some workarounds proposed, but the pledge of how delegates will be assigned and so on. But end of the day, the Electoral College and the Senate both need to be changed, in my opinion. Digitized voting process. So you should be able to audit every election with transparency. Anyone should be able to see their own vote. You should be able to look on it, in a list of encrypted data or whatnot, and like, that is my vote. It was recorded correctly. Anyone should be able to sum up the totals. Like, here are all the votes. We have asked we polled our electorate. We've asked people at random to view their vote to make sure it's valid. That's my vote. So a sufficiently large population sample in that case would say, okay, so this is probably a valid representation of how people actually voted. They wouldn't have to divulge their vote nor their identity. They would just simply have to, as a human, indicate that, yes, I see my vote and it's recorded correctly. Then you can sum the votes yourself, and you should be able to come up with the same answer that is recorded officially. Right now, we rely on those. Now, granted, I just got done earlier saying that people, the citizenry, the people in your community who take the time to participate at a polling place, as I did, take it seriously. So I did not go to the polling place and think, how can I skew this vote? It was, how can we be fair and take our civic duty seriously, which everybody did, as far as I could tell. So if we run into cases where that is not trusted, where countable totals are not uncountable totals are presented from people, or they're presented as announcements from people who were in smoky back rooms. Not always the case, but accusations are made. Public announcements that come out of nowhere. How could they come up with that number? They were leading last night and now they've lost in the morning, because that's how counting works. And by the way, there are some really good mathematical analyses of these effects. I can't remember the name of it. There is a specific effect that shows this skewing of counted totals as the count proceeds. Matt Parker did a whole video on that several years ago around some election controversy. Maybe someday we'll talk about that specifically. So trusting the results as reported is tricky. It's a tricky thing that can erode quickly with propaganda spreading and accusations and finger pointing. And again, but we were winning last night, and then they opened up all those mail-in ballots, and of course it was all a lie and rigged. So if such claims are made, we live in an age where you could verify data without compromising personal identity and so on. So we just would have to do that. Instead, we have a 100% complete and total breach of present and historical Social Security number data with address history, correct full names, email addresses, and so on. And nobody's really talking about that. The thing that is used to identify people for most financial transactions, among other things, has been completely broken. The last point I will make is regarding direct engagement. This is actually happening to a degree. Social media tools are available to everyone. You could even drop billions of dollars into your own Mastodon tools to lose money somehow. The noise levels and presence of automated tools and robots tend to skew opinions. You can rile up discussions. You can make things trend. You can artificially inflate likes or traffic numbers in general. So you can manipulate these pieces of telemetry, I suppose, that show how a particular candidate or a particular topic is moving through the public discussion space, public square in quotes, big quotes, with eye rolls. But these are tools that are available now, and so you can actually engage with your constituency. Maybe it's tricky to do at national scale. A presidential candidate, for example, probably could spend more time than they have on the planet trying to keep up with and in any way engage, respond to, or otherwise the discourse that can happen on a platform like Twitter X, or hopefully better tools. But that's just not possible. But it is possible to engage in some discussion now and then and so on. So these tools are available. The tools of modernity are at hand. You may not drive the representative's actions directly, but if you can express opinions in a way that other people can see, so real introspective surveying, rolling surveys, you should be able to figure out how people in your locality, your district or precinct or ward or whatever it is, like, oh, what do we think about a particular policy decision, about a particular deliberation going on? Maybe a national law that will impact farming sectors or technology sectors, or et cetera, et cetera. So what do we think here? And then how does what we think here fit into what other people think in other places? In a representative form of government, the representatives could actually capture that sentiment, possibly informed sentiment, and have that have that aggregation of opinion and introspection be a component of their own deliberations and decision making, and eventually how they would vote. So if our representatives are informed and their constituency is informed, then we have an actual interactive representative form of government, which is what we're supposed to have, of course, until the next election cycle, when all of those opinions and expressions of interest in what your constituency thinks and how decisions are made becomes fodder for political advertising, and the entire loop begins anew. So those are some thoughts on our various components, not all, of our electoral process, especially for national elections. As someone who has participated in a polling place once, I have not done it in Nevada. I should at some point. Volunteering at a polling place is minimal effort with substantial return because you become a little bit more aware of how these processes work or how they're supposed to work. And when you see someone reporting on the news that, oh, this thing happened, you're like, well, none of that happened where I was working. So how could that happen where they are saying it did? And then you might further think, but there are processes in place. When I went to my polling place worker training session, they tell you to don't do this, do that instead. Make sure you sign here. Make sure you put a tamper evidence seal across the closure of this. All these things are accounted for. So yeah, what's being reported to me? So if you become familiar with how those things work, it's a little bit easier to be an informed consumer of media on the topics at hand. Anyway, hopefully there will be some additional conversation into the future as the FFS Talk audio program finds its footing and establishes an audience and perhaps an interactive audience. So yeah, we're only 40 episodes in. I would like to, through my other efforts with the In Las Vegas project, get the word out more, but have more public discussion, conversation, and so on. I don't remember if I mentioned it here on this program a couple weeks ago. There's a platform called Two-Way. I'm interested in how they are doing it, but I've kind of noticed over time that they've skewed towards the usual like professional media pundits. They get a lot of the same people on, sprinkled with a few random people. I think you just end up with teacher student. You get people on the stage lecturing to people in the audience. You get the same faces over and over. You get politically charged discussion under the guise of keeping it fair, etc. I'll leave it there, but I'm not as impressed with the Two-Way implementation, but the notion is a good one, I think, and it's something to think about at a state or county level rather than national, but we'll see. In the meantime, do check out buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo. I will purchase some throat lozenges perhaps for the continued now dry season, even though it's supposed to be raining. We're kind of in the monsoons, but for me, you can hear my voice getting scratchy throughout this episode of talking. I've paused to drink water. I did not have tea this morning. I normally try to. That may be the difference. But either way, thank you for putting up with my scratchy voice. I don't know how I do it. But yeah, buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo. Check those out. They don't change often at the moment, but ideally, as more time becomes available for my random projects, they will. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more ongoing FFS talk. Perhaps join in.